All right, Rick, stay there. Lisa, are you ready to talk?
I'm ready to talk.
We have the ruling, the SCOTUS releasing their decision on the firing of Fed Governor Lisa Cook, whether or not the president has the authority to do it.
And the answer is that the government, the application of the Department of Justice is denied, that Lisa Cook is not someone who can be dismissed for cause. The government wanted...
The government, meaning the White House.
The White House, the Department of Justice, wanted to be able to fire Lisa Cook immediately. There was a decision from a lower court that stayed the president's ability to fire her, and the Supreme Court is saying, we're not getting involved in this stage. Now, I think, Steph, one of the surprises here is as close as it was, because when we heard oral argument, it seemed like a variety of different justices were sort of struggling with this case, but most of them seemed to think what had happened was somehow not right. And what you saw was almost like a choose-your-own-adventure version of the Supreme Court, where lots of different justices seemed to be suggesting, hey, this doesn't sit right with me. But today's decision is 5-4. Justice Roberts writing for the majority with the 3 liberals and Justice Kavanaugh joining him, and 4 different dissents from that opinion, which I have not had an opportunity to go through. I think the other part of this is that this was also decided in tandem with a different case where somebody else, who was fired from a regulatory agency, Rebecca Slaughter, who was a member of the Federal Trade Commission, she also challenged...
Head of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics.
Also challenged her firing, and the court there is saying no. The removal provision that she was challenging, that's in violation of separation of powers, that the president did have the authority to fire her, and that they are then going to revisit decades and decades of precedent about sort of these quasi-independent agencies that have been set up with multiple members of multiple parties and staggered terms. It seems now that all of that is up for grab, that a president can install people that he or she wishes in some of these agencies to make the kind of regulatory policy that he or she sees fit, without the kind of supervision and really close rigor that courts have imposed for decades. So you don't just need for cause to be able to get rid of somebody like Rebecca Slaughter now. All you need is a president exercising their constitutional authority to say, hey, get out of here. I don't want you anymore.
And she was appointed by Donald Trump to the FTC in 2018, and then he changed his mind most recently. Okay, Harry Litman, I'm going to go from being thoroughly confused to marginally confused. What's your take?
The important point here, Steph, is that they have threaded the needle. Over the last few years, they have again and again said restrictions on a president's removal power, not appointment power, but removal, to say you can only remove for cause. They have struck them down one after the other. And this last one with the FTC, they have again struck down, and it's in a way the big one because it overrules a really long-standing precedent that Rick and I, everyone teaches in law school. But for the Fed, the 5-4 decision is no, there the restriction can stay. You can still tell the president that there has to be a reason, a decent reason to fire. And I think it's very hard to rationalize just on logic, and it really rests on a understanding that, wow, you give the president the kind of power to just willy-nilly fire the Fed, and the national and international economy could go haywire. And so we're stopping 1 yard short of the end zone to say everybody else but the Fed still has some limitations on the president's ability to fire.
All right, Ron Insana, I want to bring him back to the conversation. Of course, MS Now business analyst. What's your take here?
This is extraordinarily important for the independence of the Federal Reserve. If President Trump were allowed to fire Lisa Cook, he would then also be allowed for cause if indeed he identified Jay Powell, currently sitting as a governor of the former Fed, as having engaged in some misbehavior over the cost overruns in renovating the Federal Reserve, in which case he'd be able to fire 2 Federal Reserve officials, and that would allow him to appoint 2 more and get potentially a majority on the Fed to do his bidding with respect to interest rates. So this is critical in maintaining the independence of the Fed. He would have to be able to fire a Fed official for a legitimate cause. And the allegations against Lisa Cook about mortgage fraud have been deemed, frivolous by many who have observed the case. And so this is a critical ruling. And I agree with Harry that, they're kind of splitting the distance here between other agencies and the Fed, on whose reliability and independence the financial markets rest. And so not only domestically, but as Harry said, globally as well. So this is a very, very important decision that would have otherwise had broad ramifications for financial markets if they'd gone the other way.
I know I'm putting you on the spot, Ron. I normally have it up on my screen, but I don't. Has the market reacted?
The market's come off a bit, and so we're not quite up as high as we were earlier in the day. In fact, oil prices are starting to rally a bit. Iran denied that there were any talks, but the Dow's up 220 points right now. So we're not really seeing much of a reaction at the moment. I think had it gone the other way, you would have seen an extremely dramatic reaction if the Fed's independence had been curtailed.
Yes, because stock investors be damned. That's when bond investors, the bond market that actually controls the whole game, that's when they would have stepped in and said, no bueno.
Stephanie, I think that is a really interesting point, because as I'm looking at this...
That's how you get invited back here.
Well, I've been doing good at it. Not having read the decision, I have processed and often processed many of these SCOTUS opinions through the lens of intention versus impact. And so last week when we were having the conversation about TPS and Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, I noted that the intention of giving the president and the executive branch more power outweighed what I think the justices in the minority saw as the impact that this would have on healthcare and healthcare workers and jobs. And that's sort of where the decisions broke down. I am curious, because it seemed very much so like what you all are talking about with respect to the implications on the market and its impact. I'm curious as to how much that perhaps led to some of the justices deciding the way that they did, because Absolutely. They understood the impact of it. Whereas with the FTC, you can look at the intention of giving more power to the executive branch. So I do want to encourage viewers and our audience to think about that lens of intention versus impact, because of what my friend Ron was just talking about, the impact of what this would have done to the American economy and what it would have meant going forward in terms of the president literally being able to put his finger on the scale, fire someone, and change what it was to have interest rates go up or down at his own whims, is something that I think the court understood. We can't necessarily give this type of power based off of the independence that the Fed is supposed to have.
Lisa, I'm coming to you, but I need Ron to underscore this, because it's a really important point. I also want to note we're not getting any other major decisions today. But Ron, can you help our audience understand that countries that do not have their equivalent of a Fed when it's not independent, what it does to them economically, what it does to them on the world stage, what it does in terms of people trusting, investing their dollars in those countries? Give us a history lesson. I'm looking at you, Greece.
Our experience in this, whether it's Turkey or a handful of Latin American countries or others, even Greece at one juncture, if indeed the process becomes politicized, you generally lead to a permanent environment or semi-permanent environment in which politicians, as Charles was just saying, put their thumb on the scale for lower interest rates, which exacerbates inflation, erodes purchasing power of the home currency, and causes serious problems in financial markets, whether it's stocks or the ability of these governments to borrow at lower interest rates. If you start getting to inflation to accelerate because interest rates are held down, irrespective of the economic environment, you get all sorts of distortions in the economy that make that country less investable than it would otherwise be. And you don't want to see that here in the United States, where, like New Zealand and like a handful of other countries that have truly independent or mostly independent central banks, where the decisions are made based on economic reality as opposed to political expediency. These are critical decisions. And this goes back all the way, Steph, little history lesson, to the 1951 Treasury-Fed Accord, where Harry Truman was very upset that the Fed wasn't lowering interest rates, even though inflation was accelerating at that time. The Treasury and the Federal Reserve came to an agreement to separate really their interests and allow for the modern Fed that we've experienced over the course of our lifetimes to conduct policy in an independent manner. And that was a critical, a seminal moment in the way in which the Fed operates today.
Lisa, give us more info on this decision.
Well, even if you didn't know what the holding was, if you read the first 10 pages of this decision, you would know exactly where it's going, because Justice Roberts is writing about the history of our central banking system for literally 10 pages, which is a lead up to basically saying this is different because of the importance that the central bank plays in our economy. It's never been something that has been subject to complete presidential control. And given the importance of a central banking system for the global economy, we're going to treat this wholly differently. And so on one hand, they are saying, look, the Fed is different. And on the other hand, in this case, with respect to Rebecca Slaughter, they're crafting a whole new rule that will have reverberations for years to come, because they are saying that if you belong to a regulatory agency or appointed by a president and you exert what they call general administrative control, they say that you can't be fired just for cause, that the president has to be able to have the ability to fire you for whatever reason, whenever he wants,
or she feels like.
for whatever he or she feels like. Now,
does that make sense to you?
I mean, look, it makes sense to me that the Fed is in a separate position, right? But both of these cases involve people who were fired under statutes that had for cause in them. And the court, their only way of distinguishing between the two is to basically go back in time and say, historically, the Fed has always been of such incredible importance to the stability of the global economy and our national economy that we're going to treat it differently. And also, by the way, the Fed has never been subject to the president's complete control. That, for some people, is going to strike them as, that's not really quite true. But I agree with you and Ron that to make a different decision here would have set the markets ablaze today.